Okay, so this video is a little different from the other videos in that it's not really that technical. The basic point of this video is to give you a big picture of the demand side. So you've been introduced to the demand curve and the supply curve, how they kind of work together, the ideas of the shifters, but now we're moving into a part of the class where we're trying to look at how do we actually generate a demand curve. So we're kind of diving a little deeper down. So the thing to remember is that the demand curve aggregates all the individuals in a market. It's not just one person. It aggregates all the individuals, and we're not assuming that all the individuals are behaving in exactly the same way. So the demand curve assumes that everyone is operating in their own best interests, and thus they're maximizing utility. So the idea of utility is just an individual's well-being. Again, there's no official measure of utility, but it's our kind of theoretical idea that we're measuring. Consumers are maximizing their utility, but subject to some sort of income constraint. It's this idea we don't have an unlimited amount of money to spend, so we need to figure out what's the best way to spend the money that makes us feel as good as possible. So again, as you remember from previous reading and previous videos, the demand curve is completely separate from the supply curve. It's completely separate from this idea of production of a good. Consumption and production are totally separate. So again, consumers respond to prices. As you can remember on the demand curve, they hear a price and they demand a certain quantity. And so they respond to prices and they're subject to those factors inherent in the set of demand shifters. So that's such things as preferences, income, buyer expectations, prices of related goods, and demographic characteristics. So the key is figuring out that underlying mechanism of the individual consumer as a maximizer. So individual consumers maximizing their individual utility subject to their own income constraint. Okay? And if we aggregate across all those individual consumers maximizing their individual utility subject to their individual income constraints, that's how we get the demand curve. So again, this is kind of an introduction to that big story. There'll be other videos later, and of course readings and group work, where we'll kind of start looking at some of the details and how they all come together. So remember, at each point on the demand curve, so that is given a price and the resulting particular level of demand, we're assuming that everyone who's actually buying the good at that price is making the best possible consumption decision, not just for this good, but for all goods. So you're allocating your income over many different goods, but every one of those decisions is interconnected because you're still spending a certain amount of money, and all those consumption decisions are such that any deviation would result in a lower level of utility. So that's kind of the big idea here. So the question is, how does this happen? So we can look at an initial decision between two goods. So we consume one good, we generate a certain amount of total utility from that good, we consume another good, and we get a certain amount of total utility from that good. So we have, again, this idea of total utility. So the key is, we only have a certain amount of money, we have to allocate it between those two goods. How do we do that in such a way that, given the money we're spending, we're as well off as possible, as happy as possible? So, first way we'll look at this is this kind of basic relationship between price and utility. So, we consume a good X. Let's just say we've got an amount of X, okay? And that generates a certain amount of utility based on consuming that level of X. Just like other kind of total marginal relationships, we can think of, okay, if we're consuming a certain amount, what if we consumed one more unit of X? Well, if we consume more of another unit of X, we increase our total utility of X a little bit. And so that gives us that marginal utility of X. So all marginal utility is telling us is if you increase your consumption of the good by one more unit, how much is total utility going to change? Well, the same thing will happen for our second good. We'll consume Y, we'll get a certain amount of total utility related to that. We can calculate, if we consume one more unit, what the marginal utility of that, of consuming one more unit of Y would be. Okay? So, but it's still not telling us we're not incorporating money yet. So I'm going to erase this. So one of the adjustments we can do is this idea of dividing marginal utility and price. And we'll see more of the details about this in a later video. But the basic idea is if we divide marginal utility by price, what we get is this idea of, again, the price is what we pay for one more unit. The marginal utility is is the increase in utility from consuming one more unit. So what this is going to give us here is this idea, if we spend one more dollar on good X, how much more utility are we going to generate? So how much more utility does $1 buy us? Well, we do the same thing. We divide the marginal utility of Y by its price, and then we get a measure of, if we spend one more dollar on good Y, how much utility is that going to buy us? So if we're already spending a certain amount of money and we can do these measures, we can look at the differences between these ratios and say, well, what should we do? How should we reallocate? So if this ratio of marginal utility to price for X, how much more utility we can get for spending a dollar on X is greater than that of Y, then we're going to spend we're going to move a dollar from Y to X. So this is kind of a marginal decision rule that we're going to have, and what we're going to end up with at the optimal point, when we no longer want to reallocate, is when the ratio of marginal utility to the price is equal for the two goods, or for all goods being addressed. So at some level, we're talking about, at the margin, if we're saying how do we kind of change how we're behaving, we want to keep changing our behavior until we're consuming goods such that it doesn't matter if we spend a dollar more on one good or another, we're indifferent because they give us the same kind of benefit. Okay? So that's kind of one way of looking at this marginal decision rule. And again, like I said, a separate video will kind of take you through more on a numerical example and kind of flesh this out. But this just gives you a sense of how we're starting to figure out this idea of all goods, of our being at an optimal point for all goods on a demand curve. Okay? Another video that you'll see later we'll be looking at how budgets and what we call the indifference curve, which is kind of a utility mapping, work together to find those optimal points, optimal combinations of good given a particular budget. And I can't emphasize enough, the constraint is critical. We only have a certain amount of money to spend. What's the best way to spend it? If we had an unlimited amount of money to spend, we just consume and consume and consume until we just didn't feel very good. So it's not a very interesting question unless you have a budget that constrains your decisions. So the key to this model of looking at the budget and the utility that comes from purchases will incorporate how a change in the prices, not in the budget, results in a change in these optimal combinations of the goods. So what we're looking at is, let's say you're consuming two goods, they have certain prices, you have preferences, you have certain conditions, all those kind of demand shifter ideas kind of held constant. And so what the future videos will talk about is like, you're holding everything constant, but only one price changes. Well, you can see here, if one of these prices changes, then this relationship is no longer equal. So a change in one price, holding everything else constant, will change this relationship, You'll readjust your consumption, with the only thing having changed is the price. So you'll readjust that consumption, and then you'll come up with a new combination of the goods which make you feel as good as possible given that budget. Okay, so again, we're looking at the impact of a single price, holding all the other factors constant like income, preferences, prices of related goods, etc. So this should sound familiar because these are the demand shifters. So again, everything is starting to kind of come together. So the demand curve gives us all these kind of price, again, I'll just put this here, gives us all these price quantity combinations. So even though we're talking about the quantity of one particular good on the demand curve, number one, this is a quantity which maximizes the utility, but at the same time, all the consumption of all the other goods are also at some sort of optimum given an income, given everybody's income. If the price changes, so if one of the prices changes, then everything else will change, but only as a result of that one price changing. Okay? Again, remember from our kind of work with the supply and demand, when it's only a price change, that's a movement along that demand curve. It is not a shift. So all those relationships are constant. The income, the preferences, the prices of related goods, etc., all that is still the same. Okay? So remember, this video is only kind of to give you an idea of what's operating behind that demand curve. Other videos like the ratio of margin utility price, you'll see a video on the budget lines, a video on the indifference curve, and how that budget line and indifference curve come together to generate an optimal combination of goods subject to an income budget constraint. You'll see how it all comes together, and then we'll come back and talk about how it, having gone through all those pieces, we'll see how it fits together with the demand curve. Okay?